What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in today, especially after the weekend that we just got to witness. We have a ton to get into because we are coming off of not only the best week of the season so far, but one of the most entertaining Saturdays of college football that I've ever watched, and potentially one of the craziest days in college football history. It is October 8th, 2024, and college football has broken wide open. I said in the preview episode last week that the upcoming slate was one that had a ton of potential to go off the rails, and it certainly did that. Saturday was incredible. We got so much shaken up in the 2024 landscape, and we're going to be breaking it all down today. Number 1 Alabama went on the road to Vanderbilt. They're coming off the massive emotional win over Georgia. They're back at number 1 in the AP poll. Kalen DeBoer's got the Tide riding high. Alabama fans are outnumbering Vandy fans like 80-20 or something like that in Nashville. Nick Saban said on Pat McAfee's show last week that Vanderbilt's the only place that isn't hard to play because it's usually a de facto home environment for the road team. And the Crimson Tide was a 22-point favorite going into Saturday. Then the game started, and Vanderbilt got out to a quick 13-0 lead after a touchdown and a pick six. And it felt like one of those games where it's like, all right, Vandy got out to a quick start. Alabama's going to settle in. They'll get things going, and it'll end up being like a 35-16 victory for Alabama. We've seen it so many times before from Alabama where it looks like, okay, maybe there's a chance they lose, and it ends up being a 3-touchdown win. Like USF, for example, just earlier this season, but really especially under Nick Saban, there were a couple games, like at least one or two a year, where it was kind of like, okay, maybe there's a shot, but then it ends up being a blowout. And of course, they did lose a couple times, but never in this type of capacity. I love doing the stop the count posts on Twitter and Instagram whenever a major underdog scores first in a game, and they get out to like a 3-0 lead or a 7-0 lead. And it's just kind of like in hope for an upset that we'll get something shaken up the college football Saturday, but this just felt like another one of those. But then Vandy scored again. Then they got a field goal, and all of a sudden it was 23-7 Commodores, which still is a two-possession game, but 16 felt a lot more like it had potential to end in a Vandy win. So I was like, all right, maybe this is real. Maybe this is, it has a legitimate chance. Then Alabama scores right before the half. They get the ball to start the second half, of course. They go down, score again. Just like that, it's a 2-point game, 23-21. The dream was dead. Momentum was entirely with Alabama. And then it was just like, yep, here it comes. It was fun while it lasted. But Diego Pavia, 4th and 1 at the Alabama 36. Vandy goes for it. Pavia throws an absolutely perfect pass to Junior Sherrill for a touchdown. He dropped it right in the bucket, under pressure in the pocket, just let it loose, and dropped it right into Sherrill's hands as he crossed the goal line. Commodores go back up 9, two-possession game deep into the third quarter, and then it really started to feel real, and I was like, could it actually happen? No. Ryan Williams, 58-yard touchdown like a minute later. Alabama continued to battle back, but so did Vanderbilt. They continued to fight. They went down, kicked a field goal, made the lead 5. They got a turnover on a Jalen Milroe strip sack, then drove down the field again, and this time punched it in to go up by 12. And that's when it really started to feel like this was going to happen. Vanderbilt ended up defeating the number 1 Alabama Crimson Tide 40-35. And as crazy as this game was, as much of a historical anomaly as it is, this game wasn't a fluke. And you don't score 40 on Alabama unless you have a really solid team and a really solid head coach. The Commodores outgained the Tide 418-394. Vanderbilt had 26 first downs in this game. For context, Georgia had 25 on Alabama last week. They scored more points on Alabama than Georgia did. They allowed less points to Alabama than Georgia did. They put up more first downs on Alabama than Georgia did, and they beat Alabama. Part of how they were able to accomplish that was their time of possession. Vanderbilt possessed the ball for 42 minutes of the 60 on the clock. 42-18 in time of possession. There was a point in this game where Jalen Milroe and the Alabama offense didn't take a snap for 32 minutes and 30 seconds of real time, and that doesn't include halftime. This was in the first quarter, in between the first and the second. Alabama scored, then there's usually like the 3-minute commercial break or whatever after a touchdown. Then Vanderbilt put together a 17-play drive that took 9 minutes and 50 seconds of game time, so obviously a little bit longer than that in real time. But that drive also saw the break between the first and second quarters, so that was another few minutes, and Alabama also called a timeout during that Vandy drive. So all in all, 32 minutes and 30 seconds in between snaps for the Alabama offense at one point in real time. And what did that do? Well, Alabama couldn't get anything going, especially early in the game. They had no rhythm, they had no momentum, they had no flow. And here's their drive after that long gap on the sideline. Jalen Milroe, incomplete pass. Jalen Milroe sacked for a loss of 3. Jalen Milroe, incomplete pass. Punt. Alabama's offense played exactly into the Vandy game plan of controlling time of possession, keeping Milroe on the sideline, allowing no rhythm to develop, and it worked to perfection. The concept of Vanderbilt beating number 1 Alabama is wild in itself because we had never seen something like that in the history of the sport. And I'll talk about some of the statistics and the streaks that Vanderbilt broke in a minute, but especially given everything that happened in Tuscaloosa 2 weeks ago. But I'll say it again, this Vandy team is a bit different than what the college football world is accustomed to seeing in Nashville. This was the first time that a team led Alabama wire to wire in 5 years. Vanderbilt never trailed in this game. They led start to finish, and the last time that happened to Alabama was at the hands of a team that you might have heard of called 2019 LSU. This is Vanderbilt's first win over Alabama since 1984, and their first win in program history over an AP Top 5 team. The Commodores were 0-60 against Top 5 teams. And not only do they have a Top 5 win now, they have a win over the number 1 team in college football and got it over the number 1 program in college football. As for Alabama, this was obviously one of the most stunning losses in program history. 22-point favorites. They hadn't lost to Vandy in 40 years. They hadn't lost to Vandy in Nashville in 55 years. And especially to have this happen right after that win over Georgia, they got back to number 1. Everything feels good with DeBoer taking over. And then this was just catastrophic. And as it has been for decades, this was supposed to be one of the sure wins on the schedule. Now they still have a road trip to Neyland to face Tennessee. They go to Tiger Stadium to face LSU. They host Missouri, who doesn't look like that much of a threat anymore, but as we just saw, you can never chalk up anything in college football. And Missouri did beat Vanderbilt, for what that's worth. Alabama still goes to Oklahoma. They still have the Iron Bowl, and a week after where it felt like Alabama was on top of the world, they've quickly come back down to having very little wiggle room, if any, to make the SEC championship, which then holds implications for the 12-team college football playoff as well. Kalen DeBoer has to get a hold of this team in a hurry, especially certain players who were causing a scene on the field after the game on Saturday, if they're going to be able to right the ship and get back on track. What Malachi Moore did at the end of that game was terrible. And if you didn't see, there were videos of him. The ref placed the ball down on the hash mark where it was supposed to go, and Moore just went up and kicked it and got a penalty. He took a cheap shot at Pavia when he was on the ground. Moore threw his mouthpiece, and then DeBoer and the defensive coordinator tried to go out on the field to get Moore off and to sub somebody in for him. And when they did, Moore told them both no and stayed on the field. So there is something seriously wrong there, and Moore went out and put a statement out on Twitter after the game apologizing and all that. But, I mean, that was really, really not good for DeBoer, especially in his first year as a head coach. He has to command that respect and get things back under control in a hurry. Everything they've set out to do, other than going undefeated, is still in front of them. They're very fortunate to have this loss come in the first year of the expanded playoff, but this still is, of course, a team with a ridiculous amount of talent. DeBoer is a phenomenal head coach, and if they get things straightened out, they'll be a major threat down the road. Saturday was also special in the fact that it was the 127th time in which 2 AP Top 5 SEC teams faced unranked opponents. However, it is the only time in those 127 occurrences in which 2 AP Top 5 SEC teams lost to unranked opponents on the same day. Arkansas shocked number 4 Tennessee 19-14 in Fayetteville on Saturday. Before we get into anything about the game, I need to apologize to the Arkansas Razorbacks. Last week I mentioned in both the Week 5 recap episode and the Week 6 preview episode that Arkansas basically doesn't let themselves win big games. And I said something to the effect of that they almost always play the top teams competitively. They almost always look pretty solid in those games, but they rarely ever actually get the job done. Just earlier this year, Arkansas led then number 16 Oklahoma State by 14 on 2 different occasions. They outgained them 648 to 385 in total yardage and lost by 8 in overtime. They led number 24 Texas A&M 7-0, 14-7, and 17-14. They basically led that entire game 2 weeks ago, but lost 21-17. Going back to previous seasons, just in 2023, they lost to number 12 LSU by 3. They lost to number 16 Ole Miss by 7. They lost to number 11 Alabama by 3. In 2022, they lost to number 23 Texas A&M by 2. They lost to number 7 LSU by 3. And heading into Saturday, I thought we were in for an Arkansas performance that was a great one, but one that would come up just short yet again. Arkansas did not come up short, though. They defeated the number 4 Vols, and I apologize to the Razorbacks. I've never been more okay with being wrong because that was a phenomenal game and a victory that this Arkansas program needed to have, and they got it done. There were points, though, just like in the Vanderbilt game, where it seemed like this one was going to slip away. Arkansas led 3-0 at the half. They shut out that Vols offense through the first 30 minutes, and Tennessee came into the game with the number 1 offense in the country, averaging 54 points per game, and they couldn't do a thing on the Hogs in the first half. In the second half, though, they came out hot. 2 quick touchdowns from Dylan Sampson. Not even 7 minutes into the third quarter, it's 14-3 Vols. Just like the Vandy game, I was watching that score, and I was like, yep, here it comes. But Arkansas battled back, just like Vanderbilt did. And despite numerous injuries, including one to starting quarterback Taylon Green, and they also had 2 different kickers make a field goal in this game. But with just over a minute left, backup quarterback Malachi Singleton gave Arkansas the lead on an 11-yard touchdown. The game wasn't over yet, though, because Nico Iamaleava threw a 42-yard missile downfield to Dante Thornton. 35 seconds left. The Vols had to get into the end zone. They ran a couple more plays down there before it was 4th and 5. Game on the line for Tennessee. Nico rolls right, has no one open, tries to run it, and then just ends up running himself out of bounds to seal it for Arkansas. For Tennessee, we saw glimpses of it in the NC State game and the Oklahoma game, in that they just really couldn't get much going early on. And that NC State game was 10-3 Vols with 3 minutes left in the half, with the Wolfpack driving all the way down to the 15, and then it took an 85-yard pick six to really break that game open. But that NC State defense gave up 28 to Clemson in the first quarter. Oklahoma's defense is better, but the Vols offense had 10 points with a minute 40 left in the half on the Sooners before pulling away a little bit. And outside of the blowouts of the worst team in the FBS in Kent State, FCS Chattanooga, and late in the second half against NC State, that offense really hasn't excelled much. And after the Oklahoma game, it felt like if a team can put together, if a competent team can put together a full defensive performance against them, it was going to give them a lot of trouble. And that's exactly what Arkansas did. Arkansas held Tennessee to 332 total yards, their lowest on the season. They held them to 16 first downs, their second lowest on the season, behind just the 13 that they had on Oklahoma. Arkansas ended a lot of their drives really quickly. Tennessee only had the ball for 24 and a half minutes, their lowest time of possession on the season. Arkansas possessed the ball for 11 more minutes and kept getting it back to their offense and giving them a chance, and they finally took advantage of it late in the game. So moving forward for the Vols, Nico's still young, of course, and it feels like he's only going to get better. And Dylan Sampson has been phenomenal, and the receiver group's really solid, but generally speaking, when they aren't playing Kent State or Chattanooga or late in the second half against a struggling NC State team that I think has 4 losses now, when they've faced a formidable defense, it hasn't been super pretty. The Vols now have Florida coming up this week. The Gators have won their last 2 games. Then they have Alabama, then Kentucky, who we saw against Georgia, and Ole Miss has a stifling defense. They have a road trip to Georgia. They capped the season with what didn't seem like much a week ago, but on November 30th, they have a road trip to Vanderbilt. So still a lot of very challenging teams coming up, and they don't have much room for error in the SEC or college football playoff races moving forward. Washington defeated number 10 Michigan 27-17, and this one, despite being an unranked team over a top 10 team, it really didn't come as a surprise at all. The Vanderbilt and Arkansas games, those were shockers, but this one was almost expected. Here's a clip from last week's preview episode and my perspective on Michigan and why I thought Washington was underrated. Michigan is number 10, and I've been pretty vocal about it on social media, but even with the win over USC, I'm really not convinced that the Wolverines are anywhere close to one of the 10 best teams in college football right now. They've done what they needed to do to win, except in the blowout loss to Texas at home, but found ways against USC, they found ways against Minnesota, even if it took having the Gophers' onside kick recovery taken away after a very questionable offside call, but and then they found a way to win after they were in a dogfight with Fresno State, who just lost by 45 to UNLV early in the season as well. Despite being 4-1 and ranked in the top 10, Michigan is 129th in college football in passing offense. Washington is 3-2 with losses to Washington State by 5 and on the road to Rutgers by 3. They missed 3 field goals last Friday against the Scarlet Knights, and they turned the ball over twice on downs in Rutgers territory. Very, very easily could have had that game. They were 1 yard short on 4th and goal from beating Washington State as well. They outgained Rutgers by 222 yards, 521 to 299 in total yardage. 521 to 299. They also outgained Washington State by 71 yards, and this is a 3-2 team that is 2 plays away from being 5-0. We're back now on the Week 6 recap episode, but yeah, it was pretty clear throughout the first few games that Michigan really wasn't a top 10 team. And Washington was 3-2, but like I said in that clip, it took some serious misfortune against Rutgers for them to lose that game. And this really felt like a matchup that could have been 3-2 Michigan against 4-1 Washington. In that clip, I also mentioned that Michigan was 129th in passing yards per game, averaging just 115. Well, that average hasn't changed much because they had 113 passing yards on Saturday against the Huskies. They had just 287 yards total. Washington outgained them by 142 yards, and that Wolverine offense looked pretty much the same as previous weeks. Moving forward, this season doesn't look anything like what Michigan was hoping to accomplish, but the drop in talent and the drop in production isn't anything crazy. They had the most players drafted of any team last season. They have a first-year head coach, and instead of defending the title, it has quickly become transparent that this is a rebuilding year in Ann Arbor, and it's going to take a season or two for them to get back to that point. For Washington, they're now 4-2. Same situation as Michigan in terms of how much they lost and what Jed Fish and company are trying to rebuild there. But the difference for them is they have a playmaker at quarterback. And like we saw with Michael Penix last season, that can make all the difference in the world. Will Rogers might not be Penix, but he's been very good for the Huskies this year, and he gives me some confidence that this Washington team can build off that win over Michigan and have a pretty solid year. He's already thrown for 1,625 yards, the 11th most in the FBS. He has 12 touchdowns and just 1 interception. Coming up, Washington has a road trip to Iowa this week, and then a road trip to number 18, Indiana. They still have USC. They still have a road trip to Penn State, and those are just their next 4. Not easy, but Indiana, who knows? They've had a really solid start to the year, but the strength of schedule hasn't been super strong in Bloomington. USC just lost and is now unranked. Penn State has looked beatable at points, but they still have a very strong squad, and we'll get to that game in a minute. Then they have UCLA, a bye week, and end with a road trip to Oregon as well. So the road ahead isn't a smooth one for the Huskies, and the road behind hasn't been one either, especially with the emergence of Rutgers and now Indiana and Washington State being really solid. This schedule has become pretty challenging. However, if Will Rogers can continue to play the way that he has, and if the kicking game can become more consistent, they've missed 5 field goals in the last 2 games, 3 against Rutgers and 2 against Michigan, with one of those against the Wolverines being blocked. So they've got to get better there, and it cost them the Rutgers game and could have cost them the Michigan game if the Wolverines made 1 or 2 more plays. But if they can clean things up on special teams, the defense has been phenomenal. They're top 10 in points per game allowed. It's just 13 per game. And if they can keep playing like this, that Washington team is going to be a threat down the road. Minnesota stunned number 11 USC 24-17 in Minneapolis on Saturday night. The Gophers quarterback Max Brosmer scored on 4th and 1 on a QB sneak with under a minute left to take the lead. It was a call that was a little bit questionable. They have had some kicking concerns, but they were at the 1 yard line, tie game, a minute left, 4th down. Could have taken the field goal to go up 20-17, but they decided to go for the touchdown. QB sneaked it, got it, went up 24-17, and then sealed it with an interception in the end zone on USC's drive for the win. We'll talk more about Brosmer at the end of the episode. He was phenomenal. Darius Taylor had 25 carries for 144 yards, averaging 5.8 yards per carry. And then on top of that, he had 5 receptions for 56 yards as well. 200 total yards, leading rusher, leading receiver, just an incredible performance by Taylor. For USC, this loss is a tough one to stomach. The Trojans are now 3-2, and they've dropped from number 11 to unranked in the AP poll. Number 11 to unranked in 1 week. They are the first team in the receiving vote section, so they're technically number 26, but their 15 ranking drop from 11 to 26 is tied for the 4th largest in AP poll history. and oddly enough, Michigan's drop from 10 to 24 is tied for the 5th largest in AP poll history, so very tough week for those two. USC now hosts the number 4 team in the country in Penn State on Saturday, and they have a major opportunity to bounce back there, and I think they just might. We'll touch on that game in a second, but Minnesota moves to 3-3, and other than the 17-point loss to Iowa, they're really close, just like Washington, to being a 4-2 or 5-1 team. They lost to North Carolina by 2 as they missed a field goal as time expired. They lost to Michigan by 3 after having an onside kick that they recovered get questionably called back. They now have a road trip to UCLA, who has really struggled this year, with the chance to build off that win over USC. Texas A&M absolutely murdered number 9 Missouri on Saturday. And this was the only ranked versus ranked matchup of the week, but quickly became pretty boring outside of for Texas A&M fans as the Aggies made the Tigers look like an unranked team. Texas A&M won 41-10, and it wasn't even that close. Missouri kicked a field goal with 8 seconds left to get into double digits, so this game was 100% Aggie domination. A&M outgained Missouri in total yardage by more than double, 512 to 254. They more than doubled them in total yardage. Le'Veon Moss had 12 carries for 138 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's an average of 11.5 yards per carry. They did whatever they wanted on the ground. Connor Wigman did pretty much whatever he wanted through the air. He was 18 of 22 for, that's 82%, for 276 yards in his first game back from injury. I was pretty surprised that they chose to start Wigman over Reed, especially against the top 10 team in his first game back, but he certainly did well, and even if he hadn't, this game was still in the bag for the Aggies with the performances by everyone else. This was another upset last week that wasn't really an upset in my eyes. I picked Texas A&M to win on the preview show last week. Missouri dominated their FCS and Group of 5 opponents, but as soon as they started playing Power 4 teams, it wasn't pretty. They beat Boston College by 6, but they trailed that game by 11 at one point. They escaped Vanderbilt in overtime a couple weeks ago, which doesn't look as bad anymore, but then on Saturday they were just never in the game. The Tigers have since dropped from number 9 to number 21, and this was a massive result, not only, of course, for what it has done for Texas A&M's hopes, and they've moved up to number 15, but also because Missouri's schedule isn't one with many challenges left. Missouri's remaining schedule is UMass, which for some reason is a road game in Massachusetts, Auburn, at Alabama, Oklahoma, at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, and Arkansas. So the only ranked opponents that Missouri has left are number 7 Alabama and number 18 Oklahoma. And Oklahoma isn't quite who we thought they'd be so far this season. I do think they'll get better with Michael Hawkins at quarterback and as he gets more experience in the system. But then number 7 Alabama is really their last major challenge. UMass they should beat. Auburn has 4 losses already. South Carolina's coming back to earth a little bit after they were just dominated by Ole Miss at home. Mississippi State has 1 win, and then they get Arkansas in Columbia, Missouri. So not the most challenging remaining schedule, and this loss to Texas A&M makes that so they really have to win out. This loss is an enormous blow to Missouri's SEC and 12-team college football playoff chances because now that Alabama game is a must-win. Because if they don't beat Alabama, I don't think this team at 10-2 has a playoff caliber resume if they lose to the best 2 teams that they'll play, or maybe 2 of the best 3 depending on how Texas A&M finishes. So Missouri's really in a win-out situation now after Saturday's loss. We're heading into Week 7, and the number 1 team in the SEC standings and the only 3-0 team in SEC play is the Texas A&M Aggies, just who we all expected. But and this is really interesting because just like Missouri, Texas A&M's remaining schedule isn't a gauntlet whatsoever. They have a road trip to Mississippi State after their bye week this week. Then they get number 13 LSU at home. They get South Carolina, New Mexico State, Auburn, and then end with the AP number 1 team in Texas. So, and where do they play Texas? At home at Kyle Field. So after the Week 1 loss to Notre Dame and close calls with Bowling Green and Arkansas, Texas A&M now sits alone at the top of the SEC. Their 2 toughest remaining games are both at home. Their non-conference November opponent is New Mexico State, who did beat Auburn last year, but this is not that same New Mexico State team at all. They are currently 1-4 and 131st in the ESPN FPI, one of the worst teams in college football. And after a rocky start to the season, things are starting to come together a little bit in College Station, and it appears that the rest of the season could be a really interesting one for the Aggies. After all the chaos that we saw during the day and in the primetime slots with number 1 Alabama, number 4 Tennessee, number 9 Missouri, number 10 Michigan, and number 11 USC all losing, it just seemed like a loss was coming for number 8 Miami on the road at Cal as well. Especially when Cal led the game by 25 points in the second half. It was 35-10 Cal with just over 3 minutes left in the third quarter before Cam Ward and the Canes mounted an unbelievable comeback. Miami scored 28 points in the last 18 minutes of the game, including Ward's pass to Elijah Arroyo with 26 seconds left to take the lead. Cal had a 98.9% chance to win this game with 5.5 minutes left, but the Cardiac Canes pulled another one out of the fire. They pulled another victory out of the jaws of defeat, and back-to-back weeks, they've had a double-digit comeback in the fourth quarter, and Miami is now 6-0. Now, of course, people are going to want to talk about the questionable call of no targeting on Cal's final drive with just under 2 minutes left, but I have a couple thoughts on that. First off, I see the case that most people are making about it being targeting. It wasn't called so on the field. It was reviewed, and the officials let the play stand as no targeting. I understand the call, but I also understand the perspective that it was targeting. What I highly disagree with is that had it been targeting, Cal would have won, or that the game was over. And this notion on social media that if it had been targeting, the game was over, isn't one that's based in truth. Miami's defense stifled Cal for the entire fourth quarter, and even if the targeting had been called, Miami still had all 3 timeouts left to force another stop and get the ball back anyway. A lot of people on social media are crediting this win to that call, and it just doesn't quite add up. If you want to say that about the Virginia Tech game, sure, because if they had made that call, Virginia Tech would have won. That was the last play of the game, but this one is a little bit different. Miami still had the opportunity to win, to force a stop, to get the ball back and go score, even if the targeting had been called. Despite Miami trailing by 25 and needing the insane comeback, Miami outgained Cal by 205 yards. The total yardage was 575 to 370 Miami, plus 205 in margin of yardage. Miami had 30 first downs, 18 more than Cal. It was 30-12 in first downs. Miami dominated time of possession, 38-22. They had the ball for 16 more minutes. Cam Ward had 452 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Xavier Restrepo had 7 receptions for 163 yards. And overall, just a very, very entertaining game. So just a wild comeback there. The Canes refused to lose. The Heisman contender Cam Ward had a Heisman caliber game, and Miami improves to 6-0. Cal falls to 3-2 and now has a road trip to number 22 Pitt this week. A couple other notable results. SMU took down number 22 Louisville 34-27, and the Mustangs and Cardinals have basically swapped spots. SMU is now number 25, Louisville has dropped out of the poll, and the Mustangs are 5-1 while Louisville has fallen to 3-2. This was an awesome game, a wildly even game. Total yardage was 481 to 461 SMU. Kevin Jennings was amazing for the Mustangs. He was 21 of 27 for 281 yards passing, which in itself is good. And then he had 10 carries for 113 yards and a touchdown rushing as well. 394 total yards and a touchdown on the road at a ranked Louisville team. And I mentioned it in the preview episode last week, but this SMU team is really starting to find their stride, and they're starting to look more like the team that a lot of people expected coming into the season. They had a slow start to the year. They almost lost to Nevada. Then they had the loss to BYU, but now BYU's 5-0. They're ranked 14th, and that isn't a bad loss whatsoever, especially because that was a game that SMU really could have won. And now they have a ranked road win as well over Louisville. The Mustangs are 5-1. They're third in the FPI in chance to win the ACC at 21.9%, behind only Miami and Clemson. And they're really starting to come into form and looking like that team that we thought they could be in 2024. On Friday night, before we even got to any of the sheer chaos that was Saturday, we had Syracuse on the road at number 25 UNLV, where the Orange won 44-41 in overtime. This was the picture-perfect definition of a roller coaster game. Syracuse led 14-0, then UNLV scored 21 unanswered to take a 21-14 lead. Syracuse then went back up by 10, 31-21. Then UNLV scored 17 unanswered to take a 38-31 lead. It was a wildly back-and-forth game. It was just Syracuse would score, they would go on a run. UNLV would score, they would go on like a 10 to 17 point run. Just back and forth the entire game. until Kyle McCord led an unbelievable drive with 23 seconds left to force overtime, where the Orange then won 44-41. UNLV played their hearts out. For a second consecutive week, they blocked a punt and returned it for a touchdown. They actually had a second blocked punt in that game as well that led to a touchdown eventually. Ricky White had one of those blocked punts. He also had 10 receptions for 135 yards and a touchdown. And despite this loss to Syracuse, this Rebels team is very legit. I actually came away from this game thinking more of UNLV than I did going in. And going in, I was like, okay, they beat Houston, who's not having the best year. They beat their FCS opponent, Utah Tech. They beat Kansas, who has 4 or 5 losses now. They blew out Fresno State, but I still kind of questioned how good they really were. I had Syracuse plus 6.5 and took their money line live during that game as well. But at the end of the game, I was like, okay, this UNLV team is the real deal. I think UNLV will bounce back. I think they'll come back strong, and they're still a contender for that Mountain West title. They're undefeated in conference play still, of course. And the showdown with Boise State coming up in a couple weeks will be electric. For Syracuse, Kyle McCord continues to shine. He had 377 total yards and 3 touchdowns. Running back LaQuinn Allen was a beast. I'll save his stats for the end because he is a king of the week. And Aronde Gadsden had 10 receptions for 142 yards. The Orange improved to 4-1, and I talked about it late in the spring in the season preview that I did for Syracuse, but that remaining schedule that they have is very manageable. And winning this game was huge for momentum, and I think they'll build off it the rest of the way. A couple other quick ones. Clemson beat Florida State 29-13 on Saturday night in Tallahassee, and the game wasn't even as close as the score depicted, but FSU did block 2 of Clemson's field goal attempts, and the box score for this one is one of the most fascinating that I've seen all year. To summarize it, Clemson was twice as good as Florida State. The Tigers had 500 total yards, Florida State had 250. Exactly 500 to exactly 250. Clemson had 28 first downs, Florida State had 14, exactly double again. And then even the score was 26-13, another double up, until Clemson tacked on a field goal with like 2 minutes left to make it 29-13. So for FSU to even get to 13, that required them going 4 for 4 on 4th down, which was very impressive. They were 100%, but Clemson really outplayed them start to finish. The Tigers improved to 4-1. They have since moved up to number 10 in the AP poll, and Dabo Swinney earned his 174th win as a head coach. That surpasses Bobby Bowden's 173 for the most wins ever by an ACC head coach. Florida earned an impressive 24-13 victory over UCF, and just like some of the other games, the final score really wasn't super indicative of how far apart these two teams were. This was 24-3 at the half, and Billy Napier kind of has a pattern of doing this, but it almost feels like when Florida gets a lead, they shut down everything offensively. And this felt almost identical to what they did to Tennessee last season. They led that one 26-7 at the half, and I think scored 3 points in the second half after some very safe play calling. So 24-3 at the half, the Gators didn't even really try to score again and finished 24-13. Now, that's been a winning strategy, just playing keep away and running the clock in the second half. They beat UCF on Saturday night doing it, and they beat Tennessee last season doing it. But that may come back to bite the Gators if they face an offense that has the capability to mount a multiple possession comeback. And speaking of Tennessee, Florida now has a road trip to Neyland to face the number 8 Volunteers next week. And lastly, Texas Tech defeated Arizona 28-22 in a late finish out in Tucson. My Big 12 champion pick, Texas Tech Red Raiders, are 5-1 and currently sit alone at the top of the Big 12 standings. So the dream is alive and well. Texas Tech is 3-0 in conference play for the first time since 2013, which is the first time in the college football playoff era. Quarterback Baron Morton has moved into the top 10 of my Heisman rankings. He has the 9th most passing yards of any quarterback in the country. Running back Taj Brooks has balled out lately as well. The defense forced a critical fumble by Tedero McMillan late in that game, and it's starting to look like the potential that I saw in Texas Tech coming into this season is becoming a reality. All right, a quick recap of my picks from Week 6. We went 7-4, improving to 29-14 on the season. I added quite a few picks on Twitter from what I gave out in the preview episode, but 7-4 overall. I had Syracuse plus 6.5 against UNLV, and then took their money line live during that game as well. Got it at some nice odds right after they went down 21-14. So hit on both of those. We had Sam Houston versus UTEP under 50. Unfortunately, did not work out last Thursday night, but there were 7 points scored in the first 27 minutes of that game, and then 55 scored in the last 33. So things just kind of started to unravel after a fumble in the end zone for a touchdown. UConn finally let us down. They had been cooking for multiple weeks in a row, but had a lackluster 9-point win over Temple. I had them minus 5.5 in the first quarter. They only had 3 in the first quarter, unfortunately, because they failed a 4th down attempt while in field goal range. That could have put them up 6-0, but they chose to go for it. Then I had their team total over 4.5, and they only scored 29. I had Marshall's first quarter race to 6 against App State. That hit. I had Cade Klubnik over 25.5 rushing yards. That hit. He had 62 on Florida State. I had Cade Klubnik under 0.5 interceptions. That hit. He played a very clean game with no turnovers. And then I also had Virginia Tech Stanford under 50.5. The Hokies won that 30-7. Boston College Virginia was a very strange game. I had over 52.5, and that finaled at 38. Both teams had so many drives where they didn't do anything in the other team's territory. But a lot of going for it on 4th down and getting stopped. I think there was a missed field goal. Virginia pulled off an impressive 24-14 win, though. And then I had Pitt's money line live against UNC. Got that one boosted right after Eli Holstein threw a pick 6, and the Tar Heels took a 7-3 lead. I had a feeling Pitt might come back and win anyway, which they did, 34-24. 7-4 in Week 6, 29-14 on the year, and we'll see how we can do in Week 7. All right, now it's time for Kings of the Week, a segment where I highlight some of the best performances across the country each and every week. First up, we have Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty, the Heisman frontrunner and the best running back in the country. Jeanty's putting up numbers that we haven't seen in quite some time, and in some cases that we haven't seen ever. On Saturday against Utah State, Jeanty had 13 carries for 186 yards and 3 touchdowns, averaging 14.3 yards per carry. That's a career day for most running backs, but that is Jeanty's 4th highest rushing total of the season. That was one of his quote-unquote bad games so far, and that's because they took him out after the first half. He didn't even play the second half and had 186 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's how ridiculous he is. So far this season, Jeanty has 1,031 rushing yards and 16 touchdowns through 5 games, averaging 10.9 yards per carry on the season. He is just the 3rd player in the last 34 years, since 1990, to have 1,000 rushing yards and 15 touchdowns in the first 5 games of a season. He is ahead of Barry Sanders' 1988 pace when he won the Heisman Trophy. Through 5 games in 1988, Barry Sanders had 130 carries for 1,002 yards and 17 touchdowns. Jeanty has 95 carries for 1,031 yards and 16 touchdowns. So 35 less carries, 29 more yards. He has carried the ball 35 less times than Sanders did in that 88 season and has 29 more yards and only 1 less touchdown on those 35 fewer carries. Jeanty's absolutely insane, and if he keeps this up at even a fraction of the pace, he's going to be in New York City in December. Then we have Diego Pavia at Vanderbilt in the Commodores' victory over number 1 Alabama. Pavia went 16 of 20 passing, that's 80%, for 252 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then he also had 20 carries for 56 yards, 308 total yards, 2 touchdowns, and the biggest win in Vanderbilt football history. We also have Max Brosmer at Minnesota. He was 15 of 19 passing, that's 79%, for 169 yards, and then he had 7 carries for 3 touchdowns on the ground. He did it through the air, he did it on the ground, and he led the Golden Gophers to one of their biggest victories in a very long time over number 11 USC. And last but not least, we have Syracuse running back LaQuint Allen on Friday night against number 25 UNLV. Allen had 19 carries for 71 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then also had 9 receptions for 58 yards and 2 touchdowns as well. He also had a tackle in the game after a Syracuse turnover, but 129 total yards, 4 total touchdowns, a tackle, and a victory on the road over a ranked opponent. In that game, Allen became the first ACC player over the last 20 seasons with multiple rushing touchdowns and multiple receiving touchdowns in the same game. That's going to wrap up this episode of the show. What a week it was in Week 6. And like I said at the beginning, we just witnessed one of the craziest Saturdays in college football history. Up there with that week in 2016 where 3 of the top 4 lost. There were a couple weeks in 2007 and then some historic ones way back, but just a preposterous week of college football, and I'm glad I get to share it with you guys. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, follow if you're listening on Spotify, and make sure to follow at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.